Right.
Oh, I did it that.
That answers the first question. Is the mic working? The mic's definitely working.
Right,
You can hear that.
slightly too well.
And gracious, those lights are really bright, aren't they? Brought some sunglasses. Welcome back after lunch. This is one of my favourite spaces in the whole of the RSA, actually. It's lovely and intimate, and it's going to be an intimate, informal conversation with Jon and with us all, actually. Let's keep it nice and informal. As many of you will know, inclusive or participatory methods have been in the bloodstream of the RSA right from the very beginning, actually. It's been a consummate, inclusive organisation for its almost 270 years. Indeed, it was that approach that really first got me thinking about the RSA when it was running its economic citizens panels a few years ago, which was an initiative I eventually, with quite a lot of pushing and shoving, got into the Bank of England, where I was working at the time. And our speaker today really has made that approach, it's taken to a whole different level in a way that I'm extremely excited about the potential of. So really thrilled to be joined by Jon Alexander, who literally has written the book on this topic. And there it is.
I can't let this leave my side.
I think it probably is for sale also, Jon.
I hope
upstairs, in the bedroom. I'm not on commission. I wish now that I was. But it's definitely worth buying and reading because it is deep and rich. It's called Citizens, Why the Key to Fixing Everything is All of Us. I should say, Mikau was due to be here, and I'm sorry she hasn't been able to make it. But that does give Jon all the space he needs to tell us all we need to know about this citizen-led approach to change. So I thought I'd kick off, Jon. First of all, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Delighted to have you here. For those that haven't bought yet your book, could you give us a bit of a précis?
Sure. So basically, the book is an argument that the moment in time we're living in, which can seem like quite a helpless, hopeless one, is actually a moment of fundamental shift and change and of huge opportunity. And what I might do, if it's all right, is I'll just tell you the story to start with, of the story that in the research for the book just made my heart kind of explode out of my chest, which was the story of what's happened in Taiwan over the last decade. Because I think it encapsulates this idea of a different way of seeing the moment in time we're living in really powerfully. So if I go back to 2012, and the government of Taiwan, KMT party, was in sort of quite close links with the Chinese Communist Party, and they launched what they called the Economic Power-Up Plan, with a TV ad that said, this is almost a word-for-word quote, I'm not sure it's exact, but it's, they said, let's not waste time talking about policies and complicated things like that. We'll get on with growing the economy and you get on with your lives. It was basically shush little people just go shopping, is my summary of that. And what happened in response was, among other things, a group of hackers originally started to organise. And what they did was they built parallel websites to government websites with the URLs g0v.tw instead of .gov.tw. And they called themselves Gov0, and they said that they were forking the government, which is always quite fun to almost and what you could do with these sites was you could basically interact, you could upvote and downvote and comment, and they had little conversation menus so you could meet with friends and talk about. But basically, it was kind of an arts project to imagine a different relationship between citizen and state. Okay. Yeah. I won't overstate the number of people initially, but things gradually grew. 2014 came along, particularly in the student population, by the way. There was a real energy for this among students. 2014 comes, and the government tried to rush through a trade bill with mainland China without any scrutiny, really. And a student protest kicked off, student-led protest kicked off, Occupy-style protests. They occupied the legislature. And the Gov0 gang got a broadband connection in and started streaming what the students were doing using social media, and then it got picked up on broadcast. And what the students were doing was they were discussing the clauses of the trade bill. They were arranged into discussion groups in the parliament. And then the critical moment came, because the pressure came on the Speaker of the Parliament, who was a member of the KMT by, like our Parliament, sets aside his party, but has and to boot them out, boot the protesters out. And everyone, I've interviewed so many people around this, and everyone tells me they thought he was going to do it. They thought, and it would have gone straight back to how it was in 2012 and squished to the story, to the new relationship. And he didn't. He said, this is what democracy looks like. This is what this space is for. And he promised the protesters that if they left, the trade bill would get due scrutiny, and he would ensure that, and he wouldn't let that not happen. And so 3 days later, the protesters left. They cleaned the Parliament building from top to bottom, apparently, in one of these lovely kind of aside bits of the story. And they left. The trade bill got due scrutiny. The trade bill got thrown out. And then things started to get really interesting. 6 months later, there were municipal elections all over the country. Candidates were elected who'd stood by the protesters from nowhere, like the classic sort of, what, me? Kind of phenomenon. And in response to that, one of the leaders of the hacker movement, Audrey Tang, was invited to become a mentor to a government minister, to a central government minister, and to start bringing some of the methods and processes of GovZero into government. Things started to happen. There's an astonishing story from which we could go into more of how they crowdsourced in 2015 using an open source software platform called Polis, what is still the world's most successful and widely supported regulatory framework on Uber and the sharing economy in 4 weeks. But then 2016 came, presidential elections, power changes hands, Audrey is made a minister in her own right. And it was then Audrey and the teams there who were pivotal and key figures in Taiwan's COVID response, which, if you haven't read about and know about, it's one of the most successful in the world, characterized by the 3 principles: fast, fun, and fair, which sounds somewhat distant from some things we could talk about. But we'll get to that, I'm sure. And just to give you one example, like there was loads of high-tech stuff, challenge prizes to build apps to track PPE availability, all of this stuff. But there was a lovely story that they set up a phone line where any citizen could ring in with ideas for how the country's response could be better. And a 6-year-old boy rang up. And he said, the boys in my class don't want to wear their regulation-issue face masks because they're pink and they think that they're girly. So you need to do something to make pink face masks cool, and I think you should work with the baseball team. 3 days later, half the Taiwanese baseball team, the president, and the little boy on the national... There you go. And it also set off a nationwide kind of like meme fest on pink is cool, as well, which we could go into more. The Taiwanese misinformation response, they talk about humor over rumor, and their strategy is to out-meme Chinese state disinformation. So, it's just like, you wouldn't, like, this is fully real. I have to sort of emphasize that even to myself, right? It's like, this actually is happening. And the reason I love to start there is because I think the way I see things and the core sort of set of ideas in the book, I talk about the idea that we are citizens by nature, that we are collaborative, caring, creative creatures who can and want to shape the world we live in for the better. That is who we are. But we are also storytelling and story-dwelling creatures, and the stories that surround us have not been conducive to that for the historical range of the book is almost as ambitious as the subtitle. I've gone back to King Sargon of Akkad in 2300 BC. But I talk about a shift from the subject story as being one of the first sort of great story that crushed that citizen nature. And the subject story says the right thing to do is keep your head down, do as you're told, get what you're given, because the God-given few will lead us to the best society. And that story was more or less dominant right through until the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, when it really fell apart under the weight of rise of the middle class, industrial revolution. I argue in the book that actually that collapse of story was an underlying cause of the 2 world wars. Out of the 2 world wars, we more or less consciously constructed what I call the consumer story as an alternative story about how to create the best society. And so if the subject story says keep your head down, do as you're told, the consumer story said look out for number 1. pursue your own individual self-interest because individual self-interest will add up to collective interest. That is the new hypothesis for the best society. And look at like there are some amazing little moments of like why that was so appealing. My mum, when I talked to her, she said she told me about her family's first washing machine, which was called a Hot Point Liberator. And so you're like, fair enough, right? But what I believe we're living in right now is the collapse of the consumer story. Like that story can no longer function, can no longer guide us to the best outcomes. We can see its failings. In a time dominated, like characterized by ecological collapse, we're living in a story that says accumulate. In a time dominated by pervasive inequality, we're telling ourselves we're living in a metaphor that society is a ladder you have to climb. In a time dominated by loneliness, we're telling ourselves that we stand alone. Like it just can't hold, and it isn't holding. And in that time, this idea of ourselves as citizens, which is always and has always been there and has always like bubbled, now I think we have the tools and the technology and the processes and the approaches that could help us step into what I call the citizen story. And the citizen story says the right thing to do actually is to get involved, to share your ideas, energy and resources, and to encourage others to do so, because that is how we'll create the best society. A short précis, you said that.
Well,
sorry.
I was going to say, should we stop there? Brilliantly set out.
Look at this.
I'm speechless. That was beautifully set out, compellingly set out. But I have a follow-up question, John. Thank heavens for that. Which is, you mentioned the tools and techniques.
Yes.
It's happened in Taiwan.
Yep.
Maybe there's pockets of it happening elsewhere.
Yep.
But what are these tools and techniques?
Yep.
And how do we make sure everyone and everywhere has got them, not just the pockets?
So, I mean, the thing I am most excited about right now is in Paris. Today is the first day of the second meeting of Paris's Citizens' Assembly. So Paris has become the first major city in the world to have a standing citizens' assembly made up of 100 randomly selected Parisian citizens. The calculation of representation includes migrants and refugees, by the way. And they have a remit, I think it's a threefold remit, to hold the elected city council to account, to decide the theme annually for 100 million euros worth of participatory budgeting, and to commission up to 4 issue-based citizens' assemblies every year. So they have an agenda-setting role as well. And they have and by the way, there's a power coded into their encoded in the structure, which says that citizens on the assembly can propose motions just like an elected member of council, and any recommendations that come from the citizens' council require a public response from the elected council. So just to say, I guess, which is just to say that is like just over the channel, right? Like in a major European city. There's a citizens' convention on the Constitution going on in Chile right now. There's a surge of these sorts of processes everywhere. That's citizens' assemblies. So that's one key tool. There's all sorts of. The thing is, this isn't just about formal politics as well, though, because it's manifesting in the rise of equity crowdfunding in business and a fundamentally changing relationship between shareholder and business. It's manifesting in the way NGOs are reforming themselves as movements and rediscovering that idea of leaderful movements rather than hierarchical organisations. And like we could talk about the RSA and what you might want to do here, and that might be fun.
Absolutely.
But that sort of spirit is, this citizen story, I think, is something that, like I say, it's manifest. The tools and processes include citizens' assemblies. But they also include phone lines, as the Taiwanese example shows. But they also include open source software. There are all of these things, and the toolkit is proliferating all of the time. The reason why I emphasised and went straight to citizens' assemblies in response to your question is because I think they are a remarkable structural intervention in ensuring that every voice that we really do mean all of us are smarter than any of us, not just, I've heard the phrase the turn-upocracy before, which is quite a nice one.
What's that one, John?
The turn-upocracy.
Turn-upocracy, got it.
So,
right.
or otherwise known as the tyranny of the annoying, I've heard it called as well.
I can't imagine who you're talking about, actually. just on, let's think about why this might not happen.
Okay.
I give one very good reason why it might not happen.
Yeah.
Which is politicians come into power to exercise power. They're not super keen, having got there, to let it go.
Yeah.
So what is it that's going to persuade them to let go of the levers when their very reason for going into it was to get hold of the levers?
I mean, I guess, so a couple of things I would say. The first is maybe to challenge the premise a little bit. Like, I think, I would hope, and from the few who I know, this is definitely true, many of those who do go into politics go into it with some much purer aspirations and motivations than to exert power, and I know you know that too. What I think is more of a problem actually is that the structures and processes of our system, because they arrive out of this consumer story, tend to condition them in that direction. Yep. Like the structures and processes cultivate a kind of a competition to serve people, do for people better than the other guy can do for people. I also think there's a very deep issue of, and it's a real shame maybe isn't here for this partly for this reason of like a kind of a bit of a hero complex phenomenon, right? And the kind of that a lot of the people who get invited into the positions of and the corridors look and sound a bit like you and me, if we're honest.
Especially me.
But I think so what do we do about those things if it's not necessarily sort of ego in a sort of pure sense, but there are certainly some of those dynamics existing. I think I really love the Buckminster Fuller thing about to change something you never fight. You don't fight the existing reality. You create a new reality that makes the existing obsolete, which is sort of, and the Gov Zero thing in Taiwan is a great example of that, right? And I think at a local level, I think that's what an awful lot of people are doing. So in the book, I start with Imi's story in Birmingham, where she's just leading this kind of transformation of a neighbourhood. I tell the story of my almost new brother, Billy Desane in Grimsby, who has started an organisation that went from fortnightly litter picks a few years ago to now they've got a £500,000 community share offer open, which in Grimsby would be enough to buy 10 houses and refit them and run them as social housing. Like people just building from where they are. But I think the where it ultimately has to go, and I'm not sure I think it can be done from within, I think it ultimately has to go to building the ways this could work slightly outside and then challenging the existing structures and systems to step into them. So I think that's what happened in Taiwan. I think I'm really fascinated by I'm working a bit on the moment on something built around. So David Attenborough is going to have a British nature documentary early next year, and I'm really like I've been talking to various people about like when Attenborough documentaries come out, everyone gets very excited about nature when they're out, and then we go, what do we do? And then someone goes, straws, and it's like, and you're just like, ah. And so we're trying to think like, what would it look like to create a process, a participatory process slightly outside of government potentially, like the Citizens Economic Council and how that influenced the bank, right? Yep. Like build something like that and be sufficiently smart about the design and the timing such that something like an Attenborough documentary could lightning conduct electricity into it and make it impossible to ignore. Like these. That's one example, but it's that sort of thing that I think might be able to show us the space that we could move into.
We've got the audience in a second, but one last question from me, a point from me actually, John, because one of the arguments in your book, which I have read almost all of, is actually, even if I'm a politician, the best route to having influence or power is to start by giving it away.
Yeah.
And maybe that was the realization in Taiwan as well, going back to your story, that actually this is a different conception of what power even means. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think power is I guess it's the idea that actually it comes from this notion that all of us are smarter than any of us, isn't it? And it's going like true power, the true role of a leader is that of a facilitator and a convener and a channel. And I really loved Audrey Tang, the Taiwanese digital minister now, who I interviewed a few times. And when I was talking to her, she said, I said, God, people in Taiwan must really trust the government for this stuff to work, for you to do this stuff. And what she said to me was, we actively don't want people to trust government. What we want and what I devote my working life to is government trusting people.
Right, nice.
Yeah, I made that noise too. But it is that kind of, and because when you do that, and when you make that flip, you do just go, power is with, power is not zero sum, power is not finite, and you get somewhere really special, I think.
On which note, let's pass power now into the audience and take some questions or reflections or questions for Jon. Let's go, should we start here and then to here?
I'm fascinated by the concepts. I think it's not really a question per se, but it's, I live in the north of the country, everyone above Watford. I'm moving into Leeds area, and Yorkshire has a strong identity, but even Yorkshire wouldn't come together as an entire entity. And I've met some of the local MPs and politicians who believe that they represent their local people. And I think the idea of this Citizens' Council is absolutely fantastic, but there's talk about rewriting the ministerial code. I'd really like someone to remind them that they're public servants, at the end of the day, and we do, that sense of, they do go in. I'm sure MPs, I know MPs, I've known prospective parliamentary candidates who really, really want to do their bit, and then something happens when they get sucked into that machine, and I think, we have got to do something really different. We've got to have a different perspective. But we've got to make people feel that they really do have that power. They have a power to vote all the time, but they feel that, there's no point, nothing ever changes. So I hope, I pray for that lightning David Attenborough moment.
There's a very quick couple of reflections. Yeah. One is, I'm not sure I want to really get that idea of servant. I really prefer the language of facilitator and convener, because the one thing I would love to do is if every MP got facilitation training. I think that would be like the single most incredible intervention you could make. Which is a big part of facilitation, active listening, yeah. Case in point. But I think there is a danger that the idea of service becomes a sort of, like, I'm really fucked up with the kind of the working hard for you narrative. It's like we'll do it for you, and it's like, no, do it with us. Like, hold this, like, let's do this together. Not like, don't compete to serve me. Yeah. Involve me. Yeah.
Nice. Oh, we'll go here. Next question here. Come down the front.
Thanks very much. Hi, Jon. I'm getting a feeling that this is breaking down into a conflict between citizen and government. This morning we sat in a session in which we talked about ESG as if it was a new concept. Josh Mailman formed the Social Venture Network in 1987 when people like Ben Cohen and Gordon Roddick not only promised, but implemented paying themselves only 7 times more than their poorest paid employee. We had people on the stage today who were paid 70 times what their poorest employees were being paid. And there was no discussion of the power that had to be let go by the top of corporate Britain or the top of corporate America or wherever it is. Isn't the real challenge here? And just sorry to go on. And citizens, thus feeling disenfranchised in that power, are seeking recourse through right-wing demagogues like Bolsonaro and Trump and, dare I say, Johnson.
Yeah.
Isn't it the case that we've got to find a way of forcing or enabling or facilitating the sharing and giving up of power of the people who are on top of corporate capitalist structure really necessary in order to enable people, the citizens you're talking about, to take up that power?
I mean, I would say, I mean, again, so firstly, I would say that the opposition I would seek to construct is not between citizen and government, or even the focal point. I would seek to focus the energy on the shift and the contrast between the idea of people as consumers and the idea of people as citizens. And I think, like in political terms, we live in a consumer democracy which limits our agency to choosing between options that someone else sets and encourages us to make that choice on the basis of individual self-interest. That's what a consumer democracy looks like versus. But in business, that is even more present, right? Like the relationship between us and business as consumers rather than as participants. But in many ways, though, I come back to the same thing. I'm not sure I want to fight the existing reality, or at least I think that's important, but it's not necessarily where my energy is. What I'm really interested in is this new wave of things like equity crowdfunding, things like shareholder movements, things where actually people are, I mean, I'm working at the moment with several people on the idea of bringing some of these deliberative democracy structures into corporate governance, like, and renewing the contract between citizen and state that way. And these sorts of things, I think, imagine a different relationship between business and society where the word corporate citizenship might actually mean something. And so, yeah, I guess I'm just going, that contrast of consumer to citizen, if we can look there and go, what would it really look like for us to be citizens in relation to business? That would be kind of where I would want to play.
Brilliant. I would say one very last quick question, because I know time is up, and then we'll bring things.
I was going to ask a question about corporate side as well, but the one I'll ask now is about scale. Because again, often these things seem very, very useful on microcosms and in micro situations, but maybe a kind of a view of how do we get to this to change the basic tenets of democracy and how we're governed, rather than unique, exciting micro trials, basically.
Well, look, I mean, the first thing I would say is I think maybe that's how change always emerges. But the main, maybe I'll finish by just saying a word about the day I kind of really decided to write the book, as opposed to kind of faff around and then write a paragraph and then go and do something else, which was actually the 10th of May 2020, the day the message changed here. If you remember, like the early message, stay home, protect the NHS, save lives, that is pure subject story, right? Like protection in return for obedience. But what was happening in this country was we were doing it. Mutual aid groups, street WhatsApp groups, NHS first responder scheme, built for 250,000 people in 3 weeks, 750,000 in 48 hours, crashed the thing. Like, we were doing it, we were being citizens, and in that moment, like, and remember how unlikely everyone I spoke to said it was that Speaker Wang in Taiwan would have done what he did. So I appreciate that this is like an incredibly unlikely thing to have happened. But what if the change in story had been to, let's do this together? Like, let's bring councils together to learn from each other. Let's provide the funding to enable this to happen. Let's support mutual aid groups and find out how to instantiate them and make them last. Like, that could have happened. And if it had, I think we would be where Taiwan was, I think. And so I guess what I'm saying, and instead stay alert was consumer message. It was individual responsibility. Look out for number one. Leave the councils to provide the services. You go back to your life. And I'm not saying that as a party political point. I think we just couldn't see it. But the point is that I think the way this will happen is I think about it as kind of sliding doors, right? Like the train comes into the doors to the story are going to open, and there's going to be more of those. There was another one with Homes for Ukrainians. There's going to be more of them. And the question is, like, do we see it, and do we step into it, and do our leaders see it and step into it, or not? And that's more the way I would see the change.
Great way to finish. Read the book. Please join me in thanking the fantastic Jon Alexander,